All the animals that live in this area are adapted to the changes in moisture, temperature, turbulence, and salinity because of the frequent tides that happen all day. The intertidal zone is also called the littoral zone. The littoral zone is separated into different vertical zones. The vertical zones are the spray zone, the high tide zone, the middle tide zone, and the low tide zone. The spray zone is dry for most of the day and is sprayed with salt during high tide. There is barely any vegetation in this area. Some of the organisms that live in this habitat include barnacles, isopods, leeches, lice, periwinkles, and whelks. The high tide zone is flooded for most of the day. Organisms in this area include anemones, barnacles, brittle stars, crabs, green algae, mussels, sea stars, snails, whelks, and some marine vegetation. The middle tide zone is uncovered twice a day with salt water from the tide. The animals that live in this zone include anemones, barnacles, crabs, green algae, isopods, mussels, sea lettuce, sea palm, sea stars, snails, sponges, and whelks. The low tide zone is only uncovered at low tide, and the organisms in this area are not well adapted to long periods of dryness or extreme temperatures. Some of the organisms in this area are abalone, anemones, brown seaweed, crabs, green algae, hyroids, isopods, mussels, scoldin, sea cucumber, sea lettuce, sea palm, sea stars, sea urchin, crabs, snails, sponges, surf grass, tube worms, and whelks. When the tide is in, the littoral organisms get eaten by fish, and when it is out, they are eaten by foxes and people. Birds and other marine animals also eat the littoral organisms during the tide. The intertidal zone is covered with salt during the high tide and is exposed to the air during low tide. The height of exposes either more or less land to the daily tide cycle. Organisms in this area must be adapted to both very wet or very dry conditions. The turbulence of the water is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to survive in the intertidal zone. The rough waves can carry away poorly adapted organisms from their home. Many organisms in this area burrow into the sand like clams, live under rocks, or attach themselves to rocks like barnacles and mussels. The temperature can range from the temperature of the water to air temperature that can vary from below freezing to scorching hot. Tide pools are areas that remain wet after a high tide. Depression in the shore sometimes makes tide pools, although they are not long-lasting. The salinity of the tide pools vary from the salinity of the sea to much less salty when rain or runoff goes into it. Animals that live in the tide pools must be able to change in variation. Some fish like sculpin and bennies live in the tide pools.